Chapter 2, Saving Sage, Part 3, Why Pediatricians Think All Vaccines Should Be Mandatory. Dr. Alice Choi loved being part of a large pediatric group. She loved the business side of medicine even more than the medicine side of medicine. So when Alan Goldstein asked her to help him as the co-business manager for the group, she was thrilled. He did insist that she continue to see patients part-time, though, which she grudgingly agreed was necessary to keep her skills up and keep her up to date with advances in pediatric medicine, which ultimately made her a better business manager, he'd said. And today was her day to play doctor, but only for the morning. Their quarterly group meeting was scheduled for lunch today, with all the doctors and office managers, and she and Alan were planning on making a major change to their practice, a change she was confident most, if not all, her fellow peds would accept. One more patient before lunch, she sighed as she walked into the next exam room and greeted a mom with a toddler who was new to their practice. Mrs. Stewart was hopeful. This is the pediatrician who is finally going to listen to me, to treat me as a partner in my child's health, to allow me an equal say in my baby's medical care. She had done her homework on Dr. Choi. She was a mother herself. She apparently only worked part-time, which meant her family must be important to her. She was a woman and she was Asian. Mrs. Stewart assumed those 4 factors increased the likelihood that this doctor would be more open-minded, more child-centered, and more accepting of natural approaches. She was about to find out if she was right. Listen to me, Mrs. Stewart. Just because you heard Jenny McCarthy whine about vaccines on television doesn't make them dangerous. I never said anything about... Who is Jenny McCarthy? She's that Playboy centerfold who is going around trying to convince everyone that vaccines hurt her son. A Playboy centerfold. She has no business even having an opinion on, pardon me, Dr. Choi, I didn't get my information from someone on TV. I read all the vaccine package inserts. I reviewed disease data for the entire past century and examined when each vaccine was introduced, and just because you heard on TV that vaccines cause autism doesn't make it so. Autism? I never said I was worried about, what, you read one book written by a chiropractor and suddenly you're an expert on vaccines? Well, I did read a book, 3 books, all written by medical doctors. But I also, what, you don't believe in modern medicine? You want your baby to die of meningitis or whooping cough? Measles? Are you some sort of religious fundamentalist who is against science? Dr. Choi, I feel like you aren't listening to me. I am not against science. That is what I'm trying to tell you. All I've read is the science, the FDA package inserts for every vaccine, CDC information, and medical research articles about vaccine side effects, statistics on the government's Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System website. Oh, the internet, huh? Vaccine conspiracy websites? Did you get your doctor's degree from Google University? I got mine from the University of... No, Dr. Choi. The internet is where everybody reads research now. You don't have to walk into a medical school library anymore. It's all online. I've researched public health department websites and CDC data on current disease outbreaks, how many vaccinated as well as non-vaccinated people catch and spread the diseases, and the Institute of Medicine's 2013 report on the safety of our vaccine schedule. Just because you've talked to a few parents who said they don't like vaccines, you're going to trust them over the medical establishment? I'm just going to ask you one more question, Dr. Choi. I made a scientifically educated decision that I have every right to make on behalf of my child, and I would like to know if you would be my baby's pediatrician without accusing me of child abuse, of blindly following pseudoscience, or of putting my child in danger. Well, even if I wanted to be your child's pediatrician, I couldn't. Not with our new office policy about patients who won't listen to science. Dr. Jones hated these office meetings. At least we only have them 4 times a year, and at least I don't have to do anything to prepare. Alex Jones liked being a pediatrician, but he didn't like the business side of managing an office, so he was happy to leave that to others. Doctors Choi and Goldstein really had a knack for business and seemed to enjoy running their large group of 15 pediatricians. Okay, so the last item on our agenda is our new vaccine policy, continued Alan Goldstein. Alice and I agree that the safest thing for all our patients is to make sure each and every one is fully immunized. We can't have measles walking into our waiting room and infecting all our babies who are too young to have gotten their MMR shot yet. And you all know how whooping cough is going around, and that polio outbreak in California has me concerned. Polio-like outbreak, you mean? Alex heard the comment from the other end of the table and rolled his eyes. That would be Peter, of course. Right, Peter, sorry. It was a different enterovirus, not actual polio, but some of our patients think it was polio. Back to the point. We feel it is our duty as pediatricians to make sure every baby gets every vaccine, no matter what. Some of these parents are skipping some of the shots that they seem to think aren't as important. And we even have some who aren't getting any shots at all. Alan's roaming gaze rested briefly on Peter, whom Alex knew wouldn't be able to let it rest. Alan, I hear what you are saying, but doesn't it bother any of the rest of you that you are talking about mandating vaccines that don't even prevent the spread of its disease? Don't you all know that DTaP doesn't prevent the spread of whooping cough or diphtheria? Neither does polio, flu, or a meningococcal vaccine. And Hep B and HPV aren't even spread in a waiting room. So why are you talking about mandating all vaccines? Several interested heads raised their eyebrows at this and turned toward Alan. Well, Peter, I'm glad you asked, because this isn't just about patient safety. This is beginning to cost us money. Alice? Right, Alan, Dr. Choi took over. It's costing us in several ways. First, I just found out last week when a patient called us to complain that at least one insurance plan has decided they won't cover vaccination anymore unless it is done per the CDC schedule. One of your patients, Peter, called and said the insurance company was denying payment on the vaccines given at her baby's last 2 checkups because they were not all given together. She said she was just following your advice, and you should have known they wouldn't be covered that way. So she doesn't want to pay. That's news to me too, Alice, said Peter. That must be a brand new change because they've always been covered just fine no matter how we give them. And that's a little scary to me, that insurance plans would now dictate how we give the vaccines. Well, that's not all. The same insurance plan now refuses to put our office on their premier tier because of this anti-vaccination policy, as they put it to me over the phone. They'll only keep us classified as standard. Sure, most of our patients only use the standard tier anyway, but some are premier, and if they can't use those benefits here, they'll go someplace else. Plus, lacking premier status will keep new patients away. But there's more. You are all aware that most of the insurance plans keep track of their clients' vaccination rates, and they generously grant us a year-end bonus if we maintain 95% or higher vaccine compliance, complete and on-time vaccine compliance. Basically, we keep their clients healthy with vaccines, and it ends up costing the insurance less in the long run. It's their way of telling us thanks. How much money are we talking about? Alex was surprised to hear his own voice asking the question. I never ask questions. They prolong the meeting, but I'm curious. I'm getting to that, Alex, responded Alice, looking even more surprised at Alex's participation. It varies between 5 and 10% of annual payments, For example, for every patient we have, we generate about $1,400 of revenue from their vaccines in the first year, and another $800 from all their checkups through age 1. Add in the few sick visits, and we generate about $2,500 or so per patient in the first year. The following years are less, of course, because almost half the vaccines are all given in the first year, and we do fewer checkups as they get older. So most plans bonus us 10% of that revenue if the baby is fully immunized on time. That's $250 a head. Each of us sees between 50 and 100 new babies a year. Doing the math for all 15 of us, that's about 1,125 new babies a year times $250. That's about $280,000 in bonuses, just for the infants. Then it takes us about 4 more years to generate that much revenue for each patient, because we see them less as they get older. But there are more of them than there are babies, so it evens out. I'll spare you all of that math, but we get about another $500,000 or so for kids 1 through 5 years, then about another $300,000 for our cohort of patients 6 and up. That $1 million really helps our bottom line, continued Alice. You know we already struggle with how much insurance pays per visit. That's why we've had to stress the importance of timely patient flow and physician productivity. That's a nice way to put it, thought Alex. Sounds better than keep your checkups as short as possible and see as many patients a day as you can. But where the hell are the insurance plans getting that type of money? I thought they were struggling too. And as of this past month, midway through the year, our on-time and complete vaccination compliance rating for our practice as a whole just fell below 95%, announced Alan, re-entering the conversation. Although many of us are above 95%, some are below, way below. Since the insurance plans bonus us based on the performance of our office as a whole, if we don't get it back up before year's end, well, he let the silence speak for itself. The pin dropping in the corner was heard by everyone in the room. Then, one by one, all eyes turned toward Dr. Peter Tommaso. Alan let the numbers sink in for several more seconds and let everyone ponder who was to blame before moving on. So, it's time to put this to a vote. We've talked about doing this for a couple years, and many of us have discussed and debated this issue over many lunches and between patients and hashed out all the arguments. Alice and I now feel we have no choice. Are there any more comments? Well, for me, it's not about the money, it's about the importance of vaccines, chimed in Dr. Tehrani. Don't get me wrong, Alice and Alan, I appreciate that you two have a knack for the bottom line, but I think, for most of us regular doctors, this is simply about the fact that vaccines are important, and taking this stand sends that message to our patients and to the community. Nods of agreement from most of the table. Okay then, continued Alan. All those in favor of implementing an office-wide vaccination policy that mandates the complete CDC schedule for all patients, raise your hand. Any opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. We've drafted a patient notification letter and some signs that we'll put up around the office. I think all of our patients will be comforted knowing that everyone around them is infection-free and safe. Alex Jones wasn't surprised by the vote's outcome, but he was surprised that Peter wasn't the only one who raised his hand in the negative. I don't know why you were surprised that I sided with you on this, Peter, confided Mike that evening as the two sat with their drinks overlooking the river. Yeah, I do think vaccines are as important as the next guy, but mandatory vaccination? To not give patients any choice in the matter? What is this, a Brave New World or 1984? Nazi Germany, maybe? Dr. Michael Jameson had emailed Peter after the meeting and asked him to join him for a drink after work. Peter had never really socialized much with the practice's founder over the years. Mike was a bit of a dinosaur, 2 or 3 decades older than Peter, but everyone loved him. He was pretty much the patient's favorite doctor, especially the long-timers. He'd even taken to coming into work in Bermuda shorts and Hawaiian shirts lately, which fit in with his casual style. Most of the new patients coming in didn't even know Dr. Mike because he was all filled up, and his part-time schedule left little room for new patients. But Mike, like all pediatricians, loved newborns, so every now and then a young family who really begged nicely got in with him. I hear you, Peter agreed. Alan and Alice played that very well. Start with patient safety and end with the threat of losing your very nice Christmas bonuses. Although I wouldn't go around accusing Alan Goldstein of being a Nazi. And comparing coerced medicine today to what happened in World War II, seriously, there's no comparison, Mike. Not even close. Point taken, and no offense intended, but we do hear some people refer to over-vaccinating and mandatory vaccination as a Holocaust. Clearly, there's no comparison to the Holocaust. But I think what medical freedom supporters fear is that if the people give up one basic human right, like the right to choose your medicine, that this is just the first step in eventually losing all freedom. 10 more steps later, all our healthcare choices are controlled by a farmer-ruled regime that dictates every medical aspect of our society. That's what people fear. We should learn from history, not ignore it when it starts to repeat because we think there's no way that can ever happen again, not to us. Perhaps the lesson here is this. What early freedoms did the German people give up as the Nazis gradually took over? Freedoms that didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Dictates that seemed so right for the people. But then, 9 freedoms later, it's too late. You're under the total control of a regime. I think that's what people fear with mandated medicine for the public good. Are we supposed to ignore history until things get extreme? Or do democratic people stand up to any first step toward tyranny? I say we stand up. Anyway, I like Alan. I hired him after all. He's been a real gem for the practice, and frankly, I don't think he would have pushed for this had it not been for Alice Choi. Maybe she's well, I won't say it again, but patient safety, really? Does Alan really think any of us believe that safety is driving this decision? Sadly, Mike, I think Alan half believes it himself, and most of the younger doctors in the group do as well. But half of the vaccines we give don't even prevent the spread of the diseases, complained the older doctor. Sure, the vaccine will likely make someone feel less sick and reduce the complications of the disease for that one individual, but in many cases the vaccines don't keep a person from catching the germs, allowing the germs to replicate in their respiratory or GI tract and passing the germs on to everyone else. So those vaccines, or a lack of them, have nothing to do with patient safety and reducing the spread of those vaccine-preventable diseases. Mike paused to look down at his drink. Preaching to the choir, buddy. And I've told that to Alan over and over again. Believe me, I've spent hours with him showing him study after study. I even tried talking to Dr. Choi, but talking to her is like talking to a brick wall. More like the Berlin Wall, you mean? Okay, I'll stop. Mike actually looked chagrined. Anyway, I even showed Alan that 2014 FDA and NIH study that literally proved the DTaP vaccine does not prevent infection and transmission of whooping cough. All it does is reduce how sick a person feels. But fully vaccinated kids are going to spread whooping cough just as much as unvaccinated kids because that vaccine just doesn't work that way. Plus, the non-vaccinated subjects caught whooping cough once, but the vaccinated ones were more likely to catch the disease over and over, so they spread the disease even more than those who were not vaccinated. It's as if the vaccine is making things worse, not better. Even the study's title spells it out in plain English. Acellular pertussis vaccines protect against disease, but fail to prevent infection and transmission in a non-human primate model. And you don't even have to read the whole article. The abstract summarizes that the vaccine triggers the wrong type of immune response, so it can't prevent infection. And this isn't some granola journal, this was the FDA and the NIH. And what did Alan say? He just shrugged and told me not to bother him with the facts. We would be doing everyone a favor by making them vaccinate. That doesn't sound like Alan, that sounds more like Alice, murmured Mike. I do remember one DTAP conversation that Alice did jump in on. She said that even though the pertussis part of the vaccine doesn't prevent the spread, the diphtheria and the tetanus parts of the vaccine do. So we need to do our part to make sure those diseases don't spread around. Tetanus? Seriously? Exactly how does she think one patient is going to pass tetanus along to another patient in our waiting room? Did she even attend an immunology or an infectious disease lecture in medical school? What is it with these younger physicians today? You know, my grandpa used to tell me all kinds of stories about his days as a medic in World War I. Tetanus was all he would talk about. That and amputations, of course. Sounds like Alice could use a history lesson and an immunology lesson. Anyway, maybe she has a point about diphtheria, though. You're too young to have seen that, Peter, but I saw my fair share doing a stint in Alaska way, way back. The DTAP vaccine does not prevent diphtheria spread either, corrected Peter, surprised that Mike didn't know this. Wait, what? I just assumed that since we don't have diphtheria in the US anymore. Oh, wait, you were right. It's all about how the DTAP vaccine is made. For the tetanus portion and the diphtheria portion, all they put into the vaccine are the neutralized germ toxins, not the actual germs themselves. Our immune system creates antibodies against the germ toxins, so if we are infected, the real toxin is neutralized so we don't feel sick, but we still catch and pass the germs. And the same is true for the pertussis part of the vaccine. Although a bit of the germs are in the vaccine, our immune response is mostly against the pertussis toxin. That's why we don't become immune to the disease when vaccinated, and that's why we still have tons of whooping cough. But how do we get rid of diphtheria then? Well, better living conditions, less poverty. Got it. Geez, if even I forgot about that, how on earth would Alan, Alice, or any of the young ones know it? Doctors know almost nothing about actual vaccine ingredients and how they work. They just assume that every single vaccine prevents infection, but many don't. This is also true for polio vaccine. The injected one we now use doesn't give you intestinal immunity. It only protects you from getting the neurologic consequences if you do swallow the germs. So it doesn't matter who is vaccinated against polio anymore, at least from a public health standpoint. And some diseases have so many strains like pneumococcal disease, HPV, and the flu that mandating vaccination doesn't prevent much overall disease anyway. Then there are the diseases that aren't spread through casual contacts, like hepatitis B. So there's no public danger there either. And meningococcus? Did you know that 10% of us carry that germ harmlessly in our nasal passages, regardless of vaccination status? Actual cases of meningitis from that are so rare, but vaccination does not prevent spread of that germ either. It only reduces severity of disease for the vaccinated individual, just like pertussis. But when it comes to making vaccines mandatory for the good of everyone around you, don't bother with the facts. All you need to know is vaccines good, diseases bad. Yeah, it's easy to get mandatory vaccination policies implemented because they are not based on actual science that proves they will reduce disease spread and keep diseases from coming back. Instead, people just assume that all vaccines are equally good, safe, and effective, so it must be good to mandate them, summarized Mike. That's pretty much how they got the mandatory vaccine law passed in California. They got enough state legislators to just stop thinking beyond the mantra that vaccines are good, they save lives, and all vaccines prevent all diseases. Glad our Washington legislators are smarter than that, Peter added, but don't get me started on politics. The two were silent for a minute, enjoying their drinks and the surrounding ambiance of the pub. So, what are you going to do now, Peter? You've got the most unvaccinated or partially vaccinated families of all of us. You probably have more than all of us combined. I don't think the group is actually going to fire you, but I don't think your patients are going to just suddenly start letting you fully vaccinate them. I've seen a number of your patients over the years. I know how they think. I do have a number of patients who totally opt out, but some eventually get most of the vaccines. They just do them more slowly. The main vaccine some of my patients are behind on is just hepatitis B. Yeah, mine too, to tell you the truth, Mike confided again. I haven't given that vaccine to a baby in years. Geez, does Alice know? Laughed Peter. But seriously, you are lucky to be a part-timer now. Your non-compliant group of uncooperative parents is too small to drag her precious rating down more than a fraction of a percent. Mine, on the other hand. So you are leaving? I have no choice. Most of my patients will follow me, and Doctors Choi and Goldstein will be happy to see them leave, especially the ones who are completely unvaccinated. Talk about families who don't contribute to Alice's bottom line, chuckled Peter, smiling. And it's not just about buying the shots. They also come in less often for checkups, especially when they've already had a child or two and know what they are doing. And their kids never get sick, or almost never, that is. At least they don't get sick enough to come in. Wait, what? Your unvaccinated patients are less sick? That seems ironic. Don't you notice the same thing? Asked Peter. I never really thought about it, honestly, but I have so few completely unvaccinated patients, I don't know that I could even comment on it. Peter leaned forward a bit. Here's my theory. And it's just a theory because there are only a few studies that corroborate this so far. I think that while vaccines work to provide specific immunity to the diseases they are designed to target, they also reduce our immune system's ability to fight off all the regular everyday diseases. Giving so many shots at such a young age has such an artificial effect on the immune system. These aren't natural germs being introduced to the immune system one at a time like in the real world. These are as many as 9 genetically modified or artificially created germ components shot into the system all at once. Does our immune system really know what to do with all of that? And the bigger question is, do we actually know what all that is doing to these immature immune systems? No, we don't. The immune system is so complex. There's really more that we don't know than what we do know. To assume that vaccines are safe and that we know everything about them is probably one of the most scientifically inaccurate statements anyone can make. Anyway, back to my point. It's a trade-off. You get some protection from rare diseases if you vaccinate, but your immune system is weaker overall. So you get sick more often from everyday illnesses that we have no vaccine for, and you get sicker when you catch them. But you probably don't catch any of the really bad infections that the vaccines can help prevent, or at least that was the original intention. Now it seems like they're trying to prevent everything, including chickenpox, ear infections, and of course the dreaded flu. But there are some studies that show routine childhood illnesses make us healthier in the long term. So those who are not vaccinated probably have much healthier immune systems. They rarely get sick, and when they do, it's mild. I know, but letting people purposely get sick is not a popular idea. And I'm not suggesting we do that. You don't want polio or meningitis or tetanus. But where do you draw the line between what we should prevent with vaccines and what we can prevent? Just because we can prevent a disease doesn't mean we should, especially when it's harmless for virtually everyone who catches it, like chickenpox. Why don't we focus on all the bad stuff, like vaccines were originally intended? I think that the push for mandatory vaccination policies that include vaccines that just don't make sense will end up hurting our vaccination system because more and more parents are going to protest against the stupid vaccines, like hepatitis B. And then they are going to start questioning even the important vaccines, like, hey, the government is trying to force me to vaccinate my baby against a sexually transmitted disease. What else is the government trying to sneak in there that I don't know about? Maybe I should investigate all vaccines. And when people do that, you know what happens. Yes, they realize there's significant risk to vaccinating, and they start to question it. I bet they would have better vaccine compliance if they didn't try to force them and just kept quiet about it. Would stir up less controversy. Who knows, shrugged Peter. We could go on and on about this. We are not going to fix this broken system anytime soon. Meanwhile, we'll just go on with our lives and our practices and keep offering to educate our patients one at a time. That's all we can do, right? You should send Alan a going away email with some of the most pertinent studies you think he should see. Plant a seed before you go. Who knows? That's a good idea, and thanks for the drink. No, Peter, thank you for reminding me why I got into pediatrics in the first place. It's not for us, and it's certainly not for the money. It's for the kids, right? And the parents. I think that's all any parent wants in a pediatrician. Peter held his glass up to his old boss. Speaking of which, how much longer do you think you will be doing all this? Who knows? I'm getting tired, and I've never gotten used to all this rain. I grew up in Texas, you know. My brother down there is an ER doc. I may wrap things up here in the next year or two and retire back down there. This place would miss you, Mike. I don't blame you. The rain here is a drag. But the trees, though, they don't have trees like this down in Texas. Arthur sat waiting patiently in the exam room with his wife and their youngest, now 6 months old. Baby Sage was sitting propped up in his lap, facing him, and he was enjoying the smiles and coos coming from his daughter. Smiles and coos that had disappeared at 4 months and were just now starting to appear again. She's back, he thought, thankfully. And now he could see what his wife was talking about. They had definitely lost her after that 2-month vaccine reaction. She'd recovered, but then her spark had died out after the 4-month seizure reaction. She'd lost all eye contact, didn't smile, didn't coo. She ate and slept, and they cried. Cried a lot. But then she came back, and Arthur wasn't going to let anyone harm her again. The knock on the door preceded the "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson" from Dr. Jones as he entered and washed his hands. Let's see how Sage is growing. Arthur let the doctor do his exam and listened as he and Darla discussed feeding, growing, and development. His wife described Sage's developmental regression and gradual recovery, but she and Arthur had agreed earlier that they weren't going to mention anything about vaccines and vaccine reactions. Maybe it was a bit unfair to test their doctor this way, but they wanted to give Dr. Jones a chance and see if he'd figure out there was a connection between the vaccines and Sage's reactions. Arthur realized that he wasn't surprised when Dr. Jones concluded at the end of the 10 minutes that Sage looked perfectly healthy and it was time for the 3rd round of all her vaccines. Should I be surprised? Dr. Jones, his wife began. They'd agreed she would do the talking because they both knew Artie would get way too angry too quickly. We have some questions about the vaccines. And she proceeded to explain what happened after the first vaccines, reminding him that she'd mentioned this at their 4-month checkup. She showed him the CDC VIS form and the warnings about the prolonged, inconsolable crying. She moved on to the seizure after the 4-month vaccines, then described Sage's developmental regression that followed. She was concise in her description, taking only a few minutes to explain what happened. We aren't sure what we should do now, and we would like your opinion. Alex Jones was glad that this was his last patient before lunch. It stressed him out to fall behind in his schedule, a schedule that permitted about 10 minutes per checkup, maybe the occasional 15. But he was also reasonable, and he sensed that this appointment would take even longer. And that's what the lunch break is partly for anyway, catch up. Alex glanced back at the 4-month checkup notes. He didn't see anything about Sage Johnson's first reaction, and he didn't remember Mrs. Jones having any concerns about a reaction at that time. Plus, a lot of babies scream for hours after vaccines. We get those calls all the time. But Alex also realized that he had no idea the CDC VIS form spelled it out so clearly as a warning about repeating the vaccine. I wonder what the CDC means by some babies shouldn't get this vaccine again after having an extreme prolonged crying episode. How am I supposed to know if the vaccine should be repeated? Alex knew they were supposed to let patients read the VIS forms before giving vaccines, and he assumed the nurse took care of that. He'd have to check. Well, let's discuss the seizure first, Alex began. I see the ER record in her chart. Now that you told me about it, I had no idea Sage had that seizure. The record says Sage had roseola. That is the most common cause of febrile seizures, you know. It probably had nothing to do with the vaccines. Coincidence, probably. The ER record doesn't say anything about this being a reaction to the vaccines. But Sage never got the characteristic roseola rash, and her fever only lasted a day. Plus, she's young for roseola, I read. If it is a known fact that these vaccines can cause a seizure reaction, and she had a seizure the evening of vaccination, why focus on a much less likely cause like roseola? Shouldn't we first presume the obvious cause? I understand your concern, continued Alex, but it sounds like the seizure was ultimately harmless. I know you feel like she wasn't herself for a few weeks after, but babies will commonly do that anyway, regardless of vaccines. I think. Do they? I don't have kids yet. Dr. Jones, we have 3 other children. None of them lost all eye contact and went silent and stopped smiling for an entire month. Sage did these things twice, after each round of vaccines. I don't see how that is normal. But yes, I am glad that now she is fine. So the question is, what do we do now? Do we skip vaccines for a while? Do we skip only the DTaP since that's more known for these reactions? And maybe the PCV vaccine too? I do recommend you continue the vaccines. They are so critically important, every one of them. Sage could die if you don't do them. Plus, the CDC lists this as a moderate reaction, not severe. Also, we had an office meeting the other day about how important vaccines are, and we now have a mandatory vaccination policy for our patients. So if you decide not to continue, I wouldn't be able to see you anymore. Even after having 2 bad reactions? They were only moderate reactions. The crying and the seizure are not what we call contraindications. Babies who have a contraindication, like a severe life-threatening allergic reaction, a coma, or permanent brain damage, like it lists under severe reactions on your VIS form, those babies could be excused from the DTaP vaccine, but not Sage. But look at this DTaP VIS form I brought with me, where it says, what if there is a serious reaction? It describes a severe allergic reaction, like you just said, but then it also calls behavior changes a serious reaction, not moderate. The MMR VIS form says the same thing. Unusual behavior is considered a serious reaction there too. That's absurd, Alex thought. The CDC can't possibly think that behavior changes are a severe vaccine reaction. Without even looking at the VIS form Mrs. Jones was pointing to, he said, Sage really needs to continue all vaccines. They are just so important. Mrs. Johnson didn't look very happy about this. What exactly do you think Sage is going to die of if I don't finish the vaccines? Here in America with modern healthcare. For Sage, The vaccines now seem far more dangerous than any of the diseases. And you're telling me that we would have to wait until Sage is permanently injured before stopping vaccines, instead of considering all these moderate reactions as warning signs that something much worse could happen if we do continue? Yes, and it's not only for Sage's good, it's for the good of society too. I'll tell you what though, I understand you are concerned, so how about we do all the rest of the vaccines that are due today, but we leave out the DTAP? That way, Sage is mostly protected and we don't risk another seizure. We can see how she does with those and then come back next week for the DTAP. Alex watched Mrs. Johnson nod her head and say, okay. Phew, that was fairly easy. Alex ordered the Hep B, polio, Hib, PC-13, and rotavirus vaccines in the chart. Oh, and the flu shot, he realized, it being October and the start of flu season. He stood up, nodded goodbye, and left the room. Lunchtime, he thought, noticing his stomach starting to rumble. Jamie drew up the vaccines quickly. She was hungry too, and wanted to join the other nurses in the lunchroom. She could hear them chatting down the hall and laughing. Sage Johnson, she read on the chart. Isn't that the baby who had encephalitis reaction with the first shot? Well, she must have ended up fine after the second ones. Jamie looked at Dr. Jones's notes from the 2-month visit, the 4-month visit, and today's notes as well. Baby healthy, no problems, discussed vaccines, she read. There was nothing written about the 2-month screaming, nothing about any reactions in the 4-month visit, and nothing written today about any past reactions. I must be thinking about somebody else, she thought, feeling even more hungry now. Done preparing the vaccines, Jamie walked down the hallway carrying the tray of Hep B, polio, Hib, PCV, rotavirus, flu, and DTAP vaccines. In his haste, Alex Jones forgot to deselect the DTAP from the list of vaccines that was automatically ordered at 6 months, and Jamie had no reason to know that he'd meant to not order it. She knocked on the exam room door, her greeting to the Johnson family ready on the tip of her tongue. But the room was empty. The Johnson family had left for good. Resources on all studies discussed in this chapter are available at johnphilipryan.com.